The land stretched endlessly beneath the pale Montana sky, a tapestry of rolling grasslands stitched together by weather-beaten fences and the occasional stand of cottonwoods. Summer had reached its height, and the air shimmered with heat, carrying the faint tang of dust and wild sage. This was cattle country, where men carved survival from the soil with grit and solitude, and where reputations meant as much as the money jingling in one's pocket. Life was hard, and those who endured were either made of iron or broken quickly under the weight of unforgiving skies. Caleb Turner was the sort of man people described with few words, but lasting impressions. Neighbors, if they could be called that in a country where the nearest one lived miles away, spoke of him as steady, honest, and as unyielding as the land itself. He was a tall man in his mid-30s, shoulders bent slightly from years of saddling horses, roping cattle, and repairing fences. His hands were broad and scarred, his eyes a sharp blue that rarely revealed more than he intended. A widower since his 20s, Caleb had learned to live with silence. He wore it like a second skin, letting it fill the rooms of his modest ranch house and echo across the acres he worked alone. For Caleb, life was not without meaning, but it lacked warmth. His ranch prospered enough to keep him fed and clothed. His herd remained healthy, and his name was respected in town. Yet, at night, when the wind rattled the loose shutters and the coyotes howled in the distance, the emptiness of his home pressed in. Companionship was a luxury he had buried with his young wife, and though women in town sometimes offered glances, softened with interest or sympathy, he kept his distance. He had given his heart once, and grief had carved a canyon so wide he feared no one could cross it again. The town of Clearwater, a dusty collection of weather-stained buildings, offered little distraction from loneliness. Its heart was the saloon, where ranchers, miners, and drifters congregated in equal measure. Across from it stood the general store, a church, and a sheriff's office whose door was often propped open to invite in breezes and gossip alike. Clearwater was small enough that everyone knew when someone coughed, fought, or fell into ruin. Caleb visited town only when he had to, selling cattle, buying supplies, or speaking with the blacksmith. Each visit reminded him of how apart from people he had chosen to remain. It was on one such trip, during a week when the heat pressed down like a hand, that Caleb first noticed a girl. She stood near the saloon's back alley, her head bowed, her hands clasped tightly before her as though holding herself together. She looked no older than 16 or 17, dressed in a faded calico dress that might once have belonged to her mother, its hem frayed and patched. Her hair, a tumble of pale strands, caught the sunlight, but her eyes were what struck him most. They were wide, dark with weariness, and vacant in a way that suggested she had seen more sorrow than joy. Caleb heard the men talking before he understood what he was seeing. At a crooked table, just inside the saloon, a man with bloodshot eyes and whiskey stains down his shirt leaned forward, slapping cards against the wood. His voice was coarse, loud enough to draw attention. "Ain't got a cent left, boys, but I got something worth talking. My girl, deaf as a post, but strong. She'll work. She don't talk back." The laughter that followed was ugly, thick with the cruelty of men who had spent too long with drink and too little with conscience. Caleb felt a knot form in his chest as he realized the girl, standing outside, was the subject of this pitiful trade. She did not lift her eyes to the crowd. She seemed practiced in silence, her stillness more eloquent than any protest could have been. The man, the girl's father, by resemblance, continued with a slur. "She eats near nothing. Don't need no teachin'. Who'll give me coin enough for another bottle?" He grinned, yellow teeth flashing as though he'd offered up a horse instead of his own blood. Caleb's jaw tightened. He had seen men ruined by liquor before, but never had he witnessed one sink low enough to sell his child outright. Around the table, the other men jeered and joked, none taking the offer seriously, though some muttered half-hearted bids to stoke the spectacle. The girl remained motionless, a statue carved from sorrow, her lips pressed into a line that betrayed neither fear nor hope. Caleb's boots carried him forward before he decided what he meant to do. The saloon's air, heavy with smoke and sour drink, closed around him. Every eye turned as his tall frame darkened the doorway. He did not address the crowd. his gaze fixed on the father. How much? The laughter died at once. Some shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether Caleb was mocking the drunk or serious. The father blinked, then smirked with triumph, mistaking Caleb's disgust for interest. $5. Enough for a bottle and a bed. Caleb pulled coins from his pocket, the silver clinking loud in the silence. He set them on the table without flourish. She comes with me. His voice was even, controlled, but a fire stirred beneath it. The father swept the coins greedily into his hand. He did not look at the girl, did not offer a word of farewell, only stumbled back toward the bar for another drink. Caleb turned to the girl, who still stood unmoving at the edge of the room. She met his eyes briefly. Suspicion and despair mingled in her gaze. Without a word, she followed him into the sunlight. As they stepped into the street, the dry wind carrying dust around their boots, Caleb realized the enormity of what he had done. He had not freed the girl from bondage so much as exchanged one claim for another. In the eyes of the town, he had purchased her. The whispers had already begun, slithering from the saloon door into the street. He glanced at the girl again. She walked beside him, shoulders tense, hands gripping the fabric of her dress. She did not speak, and he remembered the father's declaration, deaf as a post. Perhaps it was true. Perhaps she lived in a world of silence, deeper than his own. For the first time in years, Caleb felt the weight of choice settle on him. He had saved her from a drunkard's cruelty. But what was he to her now? Rescuer, captor, or something else altogether? The answer, he suspected, would change both of their lives in ways neither could yet imagine. The ride from Clearwater back to the ranch was quiet except for the creak of saddle leather and the occasional snort of Caleb's horse. The girl sat behind him, her small frame stiff as a board, her hands clutching the back of his worn coat. Caleb had offered her the reins to a pack mule, so she might ride separately, but she had shaken her head once, almost imperceptibly, and climbed up behind him. Whether it was fear, exhaustion, or some unspoken instinct, she chose the closeness of his back over the uncertainty of distance. The sun dipped low as they crossed the prairie, staining the horizon in amber and rose. Caleb kept his gaze fixed ahead, though he was acutely aware of her silence. He reminded himself of what the father had said, deaf as a post. But even so, Caleb found himself speaking into the open air, if only to steady his own mind. "You'll be safe now," he said quietly. "No one will harm you here." There was no reply, no shift of her body to suggest she had even sensed his words. The quiet between them thickened, and Caleb felt again the weight of what he had done. He had not rescued her as a man of honor might wish. He had bought her like stock. In the eyes of the town, she was his possession, not his ward. The thought gnawed at him as the miles passed. By the time they reached the ranch, twilight had settled in. The house stood plain but sturdy, its clapboard walls weathered by storms, its windows glowing faintly with the last light of day. Caleb dismounted and offered a hand to the girl. She hesitated, then slid down without touching him, landing lightly on her feet. Her eyes flicked over the corral, the barn, the wide fields that seemed to stretch into forever. She drew her arms around herself as though to ward off more than just the cooling air. Caleb gestured toward the porch. "Come inside. You can eat and rest." She followed, her steps soundless on the packed dirt. In the lamplight of the kitchen, he placed a bowl of stew before her, thick with potatoes and beef. She studied it for a moment before lifting the spoon. Her movements were neat, deliberate, but she ate as though each bite had to be measured against suspicion. Caleb poured himself coffee and sat across the table, uncertain how to bridge the silence. At last, he took a scrap of paper from the shelf by the stove and set it in front of her with a pencil. "Can you read?" "Right." She glanced at him, then at the paper, and slowly wrote her name in looping letters, Eliza May. The sight of it hit him harder than expected. She was not just a nameless child dragged from a saloon. She was a person, with a name that carried history, belonging, dignity. Caleb nodded once. "Eliza May. I'm Caleb Turner." He tapped the paper, then gestured toward himself. Her eyes lingered on him, cool and unreadable, before she lowered them again. She did not write further, but the message had been clear enough. She understood. The days that followed tested them both. Caleb rose before dawn to tend the herd, mend fences, and ride the perimeter of his land. Eliza lingered near the house, sweeping the porch, carrying water, or standing by the corral fence watching the horses, with an expression Caleb could not quite read. He tried not to give her tasks. He wanted her to feel she was not a servant. Yet she seemed restless with idleness, and the small chores became her way of claiming space in a world that was no longer governed by her father's cruelty. Still, the silence between them weighed heavy. When Caleb tried speaking, she gave no sign of hearing. When he pointed to words on paper, she responded briefly but rarely. At night, in the lamplight, he found himself studying her face, the guarded eyes, the way her lips pressed together when she thought he wasn't looking. She carried an invisible wall around her, as if each brick had been laid by years of distrust. It was in town, a week later, that Caleb felt the true sting of what others believed. He had brought Eliza with him, thinking it better not to leave her alone yet. The whispers started the moment they walked down the main street. Women in calico dresses drew together, murmuring behind gloved hands. Men on the boardwalk smirked or spat tobacco, watching as though measuring the scandal. Bought himself a wife. One voice muttered too loudly to be accidental. More like a servant, another replied. Can't say she had much choice. Caleb's fists tightened at his sides, but he kept walking. Eliza walked beside him, chin down, her hands clasped. If she heard the words, she gave no sign. Perhaps she truly was deaf. Or perhaps, Caleb thought uneasily, she had simply learned the habit of appearing so. At the general store, Mrs. Whitaker, the owner's wife, greeted Caleb with her usual warmth, then let her gaze drift to Eliza. Pity flickered there, followed by a shadow of disapproval. She'll be needing new clothes, Mrs. Whitaker said, voice careful. I'll put them on your account. Caleb nodded, though the way she said your carried the sharp edge of judgment. He bought flour, salt, coffee, and nails, then left quickly. Outside, he caught a glimpse of Eliza's face. For the first time, there was something almost defiant in her expression, as if she understood more of the town's gossip than she had let on. That night, as the crickets sang beyond the open window, Caleb sat at the table with another scrap of paper. He wrote slowly, choosing words with care. You are not my property. You are free here. Stay as long as you wish. Leave if you choose. You owe me nothing. He slid the paper toward her. Eliza read it, her eyes tracing each word twice. For a moment, she did not move. Then she set the paper down and looked at him directly. Her gaze held no gratitude, no relief, but a sharp, wary intelligence. She gave the slightest nod, as if acknowledging a truce rather than accepting kindness. Caleb leaned back, rubbing the back of his neck. Whatever he had expected, tears, gratitude, even anger, it was not this quiet recognition. She was not broken, not helpless, but neither was she ready to trust. And yet, when the lamplight flickered and the silence stretched, Caleb thought he heard the faintest sound, a breath, almost a hum, escape her lips before she turned away. It was so soft he could not be sure, but it lingered in his mind long after she had gone to her room. For the first time, Caleb wondered if her silence was not what it seemed. The weeks that followed pressed both Caleb and Eliza into a rhythm neither had anticipated. Ranch life demanded constant labor, mending fences, driving cattle to pasture, hauling water when the well pump faltered. Caleb had long borne these tasks alone, but Eliza insisted on sharing the load. She carried buckets, gathered eggs, stacked kindling, her motions always deliberate and sure. For a girl who had been treated as little more than a burden, she worked with a quiet diligence that unsettled Caleb. It was as though she had something to prove, though to whom he could not yet say. Her silence lingered, a wall between them, but cracks began to show. Caleb noticed how her head turned slightly when the barn door slammed in the wind, or how her eyes darted toward the corral when a horse whinnied sharply. At first, he dismissed it as coincidence, but the signs repeated themselves with a consistency that gnawed at his thoughts. If she truly were deaf, how could she anticipate sounds with such uncanny precision? One afternoon, as he hammered nails into a loose fence post, he deliberately let the hammer slip, the clang of metal against rock echoing across the field. Eliza, carrying a pail of water nearby, flinched almost imperceptibly, her shoulders tightening before she stilled herself again. Caleb said nothing, but the confirmation set his mind turning. That evening, as the sky deepened into twilight, Caleb lingered by the barn. Eliza often went there before bed, brushing the horses with a tenderness that reminded him of his late wife's gentleness. Tonight, he stood in the shadows and listened. At first, there was only the steady rhythm of the brush against a horse's flank. Then, faintly, he heard it, soft humming, a tune barely formed, like a melody half-remembered from childhood. The sound pierced through him. She was not deaf. She had never been deaf. Caleb stepped forward into the lamplight. Eliza froze, the brush dropping from her hand. Her eyes widened, panic flashing across her face before she spun away, as though preparing to flee. "I heard you," Caleb said, his voice steady but low. "You were humming." Her chest rose and fell quickly, her hands clutching at her skirt. She shook her head once, violently, as if denial could erase the truth. "Eliza," he pressed gently, "why hide it? Why let them believe you cannot hear?" For a long moment, she stood rigid. Then her shoulders sagged, and she sank onto the edge of the stall, her head bowed. Her voice emerged in a whisper, raw from disuse. "Because it was safer." Caleb moved closer, careful not to startle her. "Safer how?" She twisted her fingers together, her gaze fixed on the dirt floor. "My father, when he drank, he would rage. At first, I would answer him, try to please him. But the more I spoke, the more he struck me. One night, I stayed silent. He believed I hadn't heard him. The blows stopped. Her breath trembled as she forced the words out. So I learned to stay silent always. Deafness became my shield. People mocked, pitted, ignored, but they left me alone. And he gave up shouting." Caleb felt a heaviness settle in his chest. He wanted to curse the man who had reduced his daughter to such a life. But more than anger, he felt sorrow for the girl before him, who had built her world from silence because words had brought her nothing but pain. "You don't have to hide anymore," he said softly. "Not here." Eliza lifted her eyes to his for the first time, searching, weighing. "And if I speak, what will you do with me? What am I to you, Caleb Turner?" The question struck him unprepared. He had thought of her as a ward, a responsibility he had assumed when he laid coins on a saloon table. Yet in her gaze he saw not a child, not a possession, but a soul demanding recognition. "You are free," he answered at last. "If you wish to stay, you'll have a home here. If you wish to leave, I won't stop you. But never again will you be treated as property." She studied him a moment longer, then nodded faintly. "Then I will stay. For now." From that night, their bond shifted. Eliza no longer avoided sound. She embraced it tentatively, as if reacquainting herself with an old friend. She asked questions in a soft voice, practiced laughter when something amused her, and even sang once, though barely above a whisper. Caleb found himself listening with reverence, as though every word were a fragile gift he dared not squander. In return, he taught her the rhythms of ranch life in earnest. He showed her how to saddle a horse, how to ride with steady hands, how to mend wire without tearing skin. She learned quickly, eager to master the skills that gave her a place beyond silence. Sometimes they rode together across the open fields, the horizon stretching wide, and Caleb would catch himself imagining what it might mean to share this life with her not as guardian and ward, but as companions. Still, not all was easy. The town continued to whisper, their curiosity sharpened now that Eliza sometimes answered when spoken to. "Miracle cure," some muttered. "Deception," others sneered. Caleb ignored them, but he knew Eliza heard every word. She carried herself straighter now, though, chin lifted, her silence no longer one of shame, but of choice. One evening, after a long day of herding cattle, Caleb and Eliza sat on the porch steps. The sun sank in crimson streaks, cicadas droning in the heat. Eliza turned to him suddenly, her expression serious. "You regret buying me," she said. He started to deny it, but she held up a hand. "I see it in your eyes. You wanted to save me, but you also hate what it means, that you paid for me as though I were cattle." Caleb exhaled slowly. I regret that I had to. But if I had walked away, your father would have destroyed you. I couldn't stand by and let that happen. Eliza looked out over the fields, the fading light catching in her hair. Then we're both bound by what happened. You by guilt, me by shame. Maybe together we can find something beyond it. Her words lingered in the air long after the sun dipped below the horizon. For the first time in years, Caleb felt the faint stirring of hope. Not the fleeting kind that dies with dawn, but something deeper, rooted in the hard soil of shared truth. Yet even as peace began to take root between them, Caleb knew the past was not finished. A man like Eliza's father would not disappear quietly. Somewhere in the distance, beyond the wide stretch of prairie, trouble brewed, and it would find them soon enough. The summer deepened into autumn, the fields turning gold beneath the waning sun. Caleb and Eliza settled into a rhythm that felt almost like peace. They spoke more now, quietly, carefully, but with growing ease. Caleb had begun to think the past might finally stay buried. Yet peace on the frontier was always fragile, as brittle as frost on a fence post, ready to shatter at the first touch. The first sign of trouble came with the sheriff's knock on the ranch door. Caleb opened it to find Sheriff Amos Hardy shifting uncomfortably on the porch, his weathered hat in hand. Behind him, 2 deputies lingered with watchful eyes. "Caleb," Amos began, "we've got ourselves a problem. Fellow came into town last night raising a fuss. Says he's your wife's kin." Caleb's jaw tightened. "I've no wife." Amos cleared his throat. "Not wife, then. Says he's kin to the girl. Her father." The words fell heavy between them. Caleb felt his stomach harden. He had known this day might come, yet he had hoped the man would drink himself into oblivion before it arrived. "Man's been telling folks you stole her," Amos continued, voice low. "He claims you owe him. Wants her back, or money enough to drown in whiskey." Eliza, who had been sweeping near the hearth, froze. Her eyes found Caleb's, wide and stricken. For a moment, she seemed that same girl in the saloon, silent and shrinking beneath her father's shadow. But then something in her gaze shifted. She set the broom aside and stepped closer, her shoulders squared. "I will not go back," she said, her voice steady though soft. Caleb turned to the sheriff. "You hear her. She's not chattel to be traded." Amos sighed, rubbing the brim of his hat. "I know that, Caleb, but the law's murky. Father's got rights, least enough to stir trouble if he pushes." "I'll face him," Caleb said firmly. The showdown came 2 days later, on the boardwalk outside the saloon where it had all begun. The father stood swaying, his eyes bloodshot, his breath sharp with liquor. Yet beneath the stench, his posture carried menace. The crowd had gathered, sensing drama like hawks circling carrion. "There she is," he spat, pointing a trembling finger as Eliza stepped forward beside Caleb. "My blood, my girl. You think you can steal her from me, rancher? You think coins buy her freedom." "She was never free with you," Caleb answered, his voice cold as steel. The father sneered. "She's mine. Deaf, dumb, useless, but mine all the same. Hand her over, or pay again." The crowd murmured, the weight of law and custom pressing on every face. Many pitied Eliza, but few would dare challenge a father's claim. Caleb felt the pressure of their stares, the judgment ready to fall. Yet before he could speak, Eliza stepped forward. "No." The word rang clear and sharp in the dusty street. The murmurs died. All eyes turned to her. She lifted her chin, her voice carrying more strength with each syllable. "I am not yours. I was never deaf. I heard every curse, every strike, every cruel word, and I will not return to you." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Even the sheriff stiffened, his eyes widening at the revelation. The girl the town had pitied as a mute shadow now stood before them with fire in her voice. Her father's face contorted in shock, then rage. "You lying wretch! You!" He lunged forward, but Caleb stepped between them, his presence a wall. "Touch her, and you'll answer to me," Caleb warned, his voice low but deadly. The father faltered, stumbling back a step. He glanced toward the sheriff, seeking support, but Amos shook his head firmly. "You heard her, Hank. She's no child and swaddling. She's near grown, and she's made her choice. Law can't chain her to you. The drunkard's bluster deflated. He muttered curses, demanded coin, but the crowd no longer sided with him. His power had slipped the moment Eliza spoke. With a final glare, he staggered away, swallowed by the jeers of men who had once laughed at Caleb, but now mocked the father's disgrace. Silence hung heavy in the street as the crowd dispersed. Caleb turned to Eliza. She stood tall, though her hands trembled faintly. Relief mingled with something fiercer in her expression, something that looked like victory. "You did that," he said softly. Her lips curved in the smallest of smiles. "At last I spoke." Back at the ranch, the air felt different. The shadows seemed less oppressive, the silence less heavy. Eliza moved through the house with a freedom Caleb had not seen before, humming softly as she worked, sometimes speaking without fear. The walls that had caged her for years had cracked, and light poured through the fractures. One evening, as the harvest moon rose above the fields, Caleb sat with her on the porch. The air was cool, scented with hay and wood smoke. He turned to her, his voice measured. "Eliza, I meant what I said before. You're free to leave if you choose. Stay only if this is your home by your will." She looked at him for a long time, her eyes steady. "When you laid those coins on the saloon table, I thought you had bought me like cattle. But now I see you bought me time. Time to remember I had a voice. Time to choose." She reached for his hand, her fingers light, but certain. "I choose to stay." For the first time in years, Caleb felt the canyon inside him narrow. Loneliness no longer stretched endlessly. A bridge had been built across it, plank by plank, word by word. He closed his hand over hers, not as a captor, not as a savior, but as a man willing to walk beside her. The prairie wind whispered through the fields, carrying the sound of crickets, the rustle of grass, the creak of the old porch boards beneath their boots. In that chorus of small, living sounds, the silence that had once bound them was gone. The lesson of their story was plain, though neither spoke it aloud. A person cannot be owned, dignity cannot be purchased, and silence does not mean absence of strength. Sometimes the quietest voices wait for the right moment to thunder, and when they do, they can change everything. And under the wide Montana sky, Caleb and Eliza stepped into a future of their own making, not of possession, but of choice, respect, and the rare kind of love born from survival and courage.